Paul Keating goes on Channel 2 tonight and gives it to Bill Shorten.
You'd fail to understand the middle-class economy that Bob Hawke and I created for Australia. And so much of Labor Party's policies were devoted to the bottom end of the workforce and the community, paid for by cuts in tax expenditures. If the cuts in tax expenditures had have been employed in reducing tax rates, then it would have been a big tax reform and, I believe, a much more successful outcome.
Hang on. So all the policies were wrong. They were going in the wrong direction from the economy that we built. But as Mark told you before, during the election campaign, both Hawke and Keating signed a letter saying, tickety-boo, all great, this is exactly what you should be doing. And despite the fact that all of those policies were known and in the market, he turns up to the Labor Party launch, he turns up, he high-fives, he made sure that he was front and centre in advocacy for the election of Shorten as Prime Minister. Mark, this is ridiculous. You can't turn around and say, before the election, please make this bloke Prime Minister. Afterwards, well, the reason he wasn't was because of all of the things that I thought he should have been elected for.
Well, that's all true. What can you say? I'm reluctant to go in too hard, mainly for the reason I regard Paul Keating as Australia's greatest ever treasurer, the author, the builder of the modern Australian economy, and the prosperity he's brought to a whole generation of business owners, traders, financiers, people who've got aspiration in life to climb the economic ladder. Has been a wonderful thing for our nation. He started himself, Keating, as a young man who watched his father's business strangled off by the lack of finance out of the big banks in Martin Place. His dad's manufacturing concern couldn't get ahead, and Keating had a legitimate aspiration to deregulate, open up the Australian economy. We'd be a trading nation. People could get finance. They could come out of a working class background, run a business and do well for themselves and their families. So that's all been a wonderful thing. Rita's scoffing, but that's how I see his legacy.
Well, no, I'm scoffing
but the sad thing for me is not what he said today. The sad thing is what was said in the election campaign, because it wasn't true. It was a tactic that betrayed the Hawke-Keating legacy, and at the time I felt sort of sad that they'd done that. But I'm glad he's correcting the record today, and it's a shame we can't time travel and eliminate that dreadful thing they put out in the campaign, which was untrue and inconsistent with his whole public record.
Well, that's it, Rita. It was 10 days before the end of the election, and it was in the Fairfax Press, and it was all about how Shorten was on the right path, and here he is a few weeks... Look, he's saying the right thing now, but when Australia was about to be conned, he was happy to go along with the con.
Absolutely. That's why I've got no respect for what's said now. It's all well and easy to say it now after they lost the unlosable election. It would have taken a little bit of courage to say something before the election. But instead, what was he saying? He was saying the voters are going to drive a stake through Peter Dutton's dark heart. Remember that? I'm a massive fan of Paul Keating and Bob Hawke's reforms, a lot of them as well. But I think he really has tarnished his legacy in recent years by just being so bitter so often. Every time I hear from him, there seems to be such bitterness and bile, or doing these dramatic 180s within a few months. I don't think that adds to his legacy.
Well, the question, will Albanese take the advice from today?
Yes.
And sadly, doubly sadly for modern Labor, the answer's no.
Well, can I just read from the statement that Keating and Hawke wrote 10 days before the election? While we are proud of the achievements of our governments, the baton of reform is being grasped by the next generation of Labor leaders. Bill Shorten's Labor Party represents the most comprehensive and well thought through agenda any opposition has provided to the Australian people. Can we run the tape of Paul Keating again? 10 days before the election, he signs what it was one more time, right? While we are proud of the achievements of our government, the baton of reform is being grasped by the next generation of Labor leaders. Bill Shorten and the Labor Party represents the most comprehensive and well thought through agenda any opposition has provided to the Australian people. Then, now...
You'd fail to understand the middle class economy that Bob Hawke and I created for Australia. And so much of Labor Party's policies were devoted to the bottom end of the workforce and the community, paid for by cuts in tax expenditures. If the cuts in tax expenditures had have been employed in reducing tax rates, then it would have been a big tax reform and, I believe, a much more successful outcome.
That's the problem with Google, Corey. It does remember 10 days before the election. May 8 is not that far to go back. You don't have to be Bramston to go that far back into the records.
That's exactly right. And I think Paul Keating's forgetting that Shorten's agenda was only exceeded in comprehensiveness and being well thought through by the Houston agenda in 1983, I think. 1993, I beg your pardon. Because, honestly, these blokes, is it any wonder that politicians are seen through the prism of just being cheerleaders, never levelling with the Australian people? If you can't believe former Prime Ministers who have a reputation for being straight shooters and straight talkers and being pretty good at their job at the time, 10 days out from an election, because they do the mea culpa later on when it's lost, then all credibility is shredded, I think. You've just got to dismiss him as a cranky old man now.